Hi, my name is Chantal Francois, and I'm an assistant professor at Towson University in Maryland, just a little north of Washington, D.C. And I'm also pleased to serve on the advisory board for the Library of Congress's Literacy Awards. And I'm really excited about the conversation that we'll have today with Suzanne Singh of Pratham Books. Can you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, Chantal. Nice meeting you again. My name is Suzanne. I am the chairperson of Pratham Books. We're a non-profit children's book publisher based in India.
Wonderful. So, Suzanne, why don't we start with you just diving into a little bit more about your organization, some of the biggest activities and goals that you serve for the community in particular that you serve.
Great. So Pratham Books is a non-profit children's book publisher, and we're now 16 years old. We were set up because we wanted to produce low-cost, good-quality books for children in Indian languages to promote reading acquisition among children. The reading ability of children in India is pretty poor, and one of the contributing reasons is that they don't have books in their own languages. There's a lot of publishing that happens in the mainstream, the top 2 or 3 languages, but as you go down the language list, and India is deeply multilingual, as you know, there are not enough books for children to learn and practice reading. So that was the reason that we set up Pratham Books, because we wanted all children to be able to read, wonderful storybooks in their own languages and become readers and learners. And and our model was a largely print-based model, and we distributed about 30 million books in the first 12, 13 years of existence. And as you know, India has a massive population. So there were 200 million children in the primary school age group. And we felt that we needed to do much more than what we were doing. And that kind of led us to think of technology. How do we use technology, interestingly, to be able to improve access to books? And in 2015, we created a digital platform called Storyweaver, where we open sourced all of our books. So our books were all available on Storyweaver, and they were free to read both online. And then we had a lot of kind of features that we built in, which enabled children to read the books offline or download them and print and use them. And we went beyond just open sourcing the books. We also embedded tools on the platform, which will allow other users to translate the books into new languages or version them into new forms. And that kind of, just took off. So we launched in September 2015 with 800 books in 24 languages. 5 years down the road now, we're at 26,000 books in 280 languages. And that language proliferation has actually come by other users becoming co-creators with us. So they take an original book from Storyweaver and then version it into a language of their choice or their need, because their children are speaking that language. So it's been an absolutely wonderful journey for us to be, from being a publisher of print books in India to actually being a global kind of platform where children can access books in multiple languages across the world.
That is incredible. Let's just talk a little bit now about how Pratham Books has been adapting the work that they've been doing in this sort of unanticipated and very unfamiliar time, where students are not necessarily in school every day. There might be additional Wi-Fi challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So we knew. So as soon as the pandemic hit, we saw a massive upsurge in traffic. Especially from the countries that were affected by the pandemic early on. So there was a lot of traffic coming in from France, from Italy, from Spain. And what we did when we realized that schools were shut overnight, and they were at the height of the pandemic, I think there were 1.3 billion children that were out of school. And teachers were trying to cope, and parents were trying to cope, and children were trying to cope. So I think we kind of had a very quick response to how we could serve children best in this pandemic, we created a suite of learning products on the platform. So while we had thousands of books, there weren't structured learning programs on the platform. So we created a program called Learn at Home, which was a grade-wise, theme-wise categorization of books that could be used either by the parent or the teacher. And each one of those books had additional resources for the teacher. So there were little activities, there were little exercises that the teacher could do to kind of administer that learning program to children, whether it was remote or in any other way. We also created a reading program with the same kind of process. It was a week-wise selection of books, by grade, again with supplementary resources for the teacher. We did something unusual. We had a dial a story program because we realized that, with digital connectivity being a challenge, and especially, when COVID struck, people didn't have enough money to kind of charge their phones and, load their phones with data. So we had a dial a story program where you could dial into a number, a toll-free number, and you would hear a story in a language of your choice. And during the first 60 days of the program, we had about 200,000 children dial in and listen to 350,000 stories. So that was quite amazing. And, our whole focus through the pandemic is how do we ensure that the books are being used in low resource environments. So it's not about having that high speed internet. It's not about having a laptop and, full on connectivity. It's really about, if you're in a low resource environment, how will we go to get content and books and learning material to you? So that's been the focus, and that's kind of guided all of our choices in terms of what we've done, during the pandemic.
Thank you for sharing that. I was able to visit the website a little bit this morning before our conversation. I was able to easily log in, set up an account, and start to browse the library. I was just first amazed by the sheer number of stories that were available and how I could search, let's say, for my 3-year-old son based on a reading level, topics in the story, characters, and everything. Another thing that really stood out to me that I would love for you to talk more about is that most of the characters featured in the stories were some shade of brown. I remember when we were talking previously, your sort of part of either the mission or something that's embedded in a lot of these books are stories and experiences that reflect the readers who might read them. So can you tell me a little bit about how that aspect of the books featured on the website is part of your organization's overall mission and goals around literacy?
So we were very cognizant of the fact that we need, because we serve such a diverse range of children and a diverse range of contexts, we needed our books to reflect their realities. And we produce, we publish, I think, over 500 books in different languages in a year. So when you're doing that many books, we're very, very cognizant of the fact that they have to be diverse, they have to represent, many facets of children, they have to represent geographical diversity, they have to represent, ethnic diversities, etc., etc. And that's, and again, if you've been on the platform, you'll kind of see, how that plays out, right? Because there are stories from, certain parts of India where children look different. There are stories from South India where children look different. There are stories from North India where children look different. But I think the interesting learning for us has been how seamlessly, stories transcend borders. And I'm going to show you, if I can share my screen for a moment here.
That would be great.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can get this done. So platform, we've currently got 26,000 stories in 280 languages that have been read, over 700,000 times, 7 million times, sorry. And they're just many, 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 many stories. I'm going to play out this one, which is one of our most popular stories. It's called Fat King and Thin Dog. And it's a king of an unknown ethnicity with a dog of an unknown character, I would say. And this story, it's been published by Pratham Books, and we would have probably done it in about 6 or 8 languages. This story is now available in 293 versions in 127 languages. And it's a really simple story about, a fat king who chases a thin dog and, becomes thin in the bargain. So, but it's a story that could be anywhere. It could be a story in another part of Asia. It could be a story in another part of Africa, or where have you, right? I think that was a learning for us, that stories transcend borders, they transcend contexts. They, as long as you've created them with a view that you want to be inclusive and you want to represent diversity, I think stories can just travel wherever. And we as publishers are very, very conscious of that, and that is kind of visible in the work that we do.
Are there any major differences that you might notice or your organization has considered with children and families accessing the books in print versus accessing the books digitally?
Right. So I think the theory really is that print is ideal for a child, because when you're a young child, you don't necessarily want to be reading books on digital devices, right? So ideally, you should have a print book in the right size for small hands, the right font size, etc., etc. But for us, the choice when we went digital was not so much a choice of print versus digital. It was about saying that print can't get to certain areas. You don't have bookshops. There are no distribution mechanisms. There's no ability to buy the books. Therefore, is digital, one way of getting books to children. So the choice was not really about print versus digital. The choice was about print and digital. So print goes where it can, and digital goes wherever print can't. So it's a combination of both that works, ideally. And I think with mobile phones becoming more ubiquitous and being used much more for content consumption, I think mobiles in the future will be a fantastic source of reaching content to children who are underserved and disadvantaged and don't have the ability to kind of buy print books or access print books.
The thing that also struck me on the website that you touched on earlier is this translation tool. And so, I was just looking at it, and I'm also just envisioning children from all over the world, like children who speak Malay and Vietnamese languages and Kurdish and English and French, all being able to sort of have the shared experience, even if they might not know that they're having the shared experience with the same exact story, with the king chasing his dog. I think that feels just really powerful for us, especially in a time when we often see ourselves as so divided, to also be able to have these shared experiences in literacy as well.
Absolutely. And I think the success of Storyweaver and the reason that it's grown so fast is because we have a model that enables collaboration and co-creation. As a publisher who had been publishing books in India for over a decade, we had expertise in 24 languages. And this is many of us being at it for many, many years. The minute we went open source, in 5 years, we're at 280 languages. That expansion of languages has not come from us, because it's unlikely that a single organization is ever going to have that kind of expertise. It's actually come from the collective expertise of a large community that's co-creating for a common mission. So I think that's the fantastic thing, that people are giving their, and all of it is an unpaid volunteer exercise. It's not like you get paid for translating a book, but you're translating because you know that there are children who will benefit from that book in whether it's Bahasa or whether it's Arabic. There are children who need those books, and therefore you'll contribute your time and talent to create those books. So that shared experience is a very powerful way of enabling collaboration among a large ecosystem of stakeholders, because you've got content creators, you've got translators, you've got illustrators, you've got content users, you've got teachers, you've got governments. Everyone's kind of collaborating towards a common goal of saying, how do we get children to become better readers and better learners?
Can we talk a little bit more about just outreach and access in general Like, how does your organization reach out to children and families and even schools and or libraries and other organizations in perhaps remote areas? Like, how might a group be able to find or access your website? Yeah, if they haven't heard about it before, how is it available to them?
Right. So I think Storyweaver is possibly the largest open source digital library for children, for multilingual children's books. And I think people find us just because we are open source. So if you kind of Google, free children's books, we'll kind of pop up, right? We don't do a whole lot by way of marketing. I think because we've been a publisher for as long as we've been a publisher, we have a lot of existing relationships. So, governments have been procuring books from us. Literacy organizations like UNICEF have been procuring books from us. So there's a legacy that we have of being a children's book publisher. And the digital the digital product that we have kind of sits on top of that. So people who know us, know that there's also this library that's free. But open source is probably a great way for people to find us. But we don't do a whole lot by way of marketing. But the fact that our core work started in India and our focus was in India, and now we have users from 150 countries, speaks to the fact that there is, a shortage of books around the world, and people know how to find, where the quality books are.
I know we also briefly discussed sort of changes in participation globally from before the pandemic began and now. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's changed and what you're making of that change?
Sure. So prior to the pandemic, we had a kind of stable ratio of users, where the dominant, about 75% of the users were based in India, and 25% of our users came in globally. As the pandemic, happened and schools were closed, and I guess there were more people looking for quality content, digital content that they could access. We saw a lot of traffic from, increase from a lot of countries. Italy, Spain, France, there was a lot of initial traffic that came from there. I think Russia now shows up really high on the list of, where users are coming from. And our current ratio is that 60% of our users are coming from India, but 40% of our users are now coming from, from other countries outside of India, which shows that, users in other countries have also been kind of using our content for the work that they do.
How about we talk a little bit about, for most global organizations and even national organizations, this time has really has allowed for a little bit more reflection on the impact of the organization on its clients, just thinking about space and access and what have you. So, are there any major lessons that your organization is taking away from this moment that might impact the way that it functions in the future?
Right. So I think some of the changes that we're going to see whenever the world gets back to normal, and what that new normal is, we don't know. But I think we are possibly going to move away from very traditional, teacher-centric, school-centric models to maybe a little more learner-centric. Where the child is a participant in his own, learning journey. And therefore, on the platform, we've kind of invested in getting a lot of non-fiction books. So we've got, I think, more than 200 books on STEM topics, and they're all done in a fun way. So they're fun stories on fractions, on Fibonacci, on technology, on robots. So we've kind of introduced a whole bunch of non-fiction curriculum based kind of topics, but we're presenting them as engaging stories and engaging narratives. And we're hoping that as children get more as children start to become independent readers and learners, they can explore topics of their choice. We very recently concluded a survey where we were testing out some of our STEM books in school. And I remember talking to this young seventh grader this young girl who came up to me and told me, we love the books and thank you for giving us the books. And it's been fun when the teacher doesn't come, we get to read these books. And I said, which one did you like most? And she spoke to me about 2, 3 books that we'd done on space. We'd done one on There's a Hole in Your Galaxy. We'd done another one on a mission to Mars. And she said, I love space and they don't teach us about space in school. And, it was wonderful reading these books. So, I think we've gotten to a point where we're aware that children might want to, explore topics, of their interest or subjects of their interest in their own way. And we're very cognizant of that, and we're kind of building that into the platform. I also feel that technology in education is something that's going to be here to stay. I think the last couple of months has kind of accelerated the adoption. And I think we are going to be far more thoughtful about our technology choices. How do we ensure that we're reaching the last child? It's not just about, doing a high resolution book, of a certain size that can only be used in a certain way where you have a high speed internet connection, right? It's how do we ensure that if you're working in a low resource or you are, in a low resource environment, how can you enjoy the book and read the book in exactly the same way? So I think we're going to be a lot more thoughtful about our, about our technology choices and, what we do going forward. I just want to give one more example, which is actually a favorite of mine. So, so as you know, with digital connectivity being an issue in India, so governments have also been kind of grappling with how do you get to the child who does not have, a smartphone or does not have a laptop or does not have a computer, right? So television, strangely, state-owned television channels are becoming a broadcast medium. Because they've got like some 95-96% penetration. Every house has a television. The state-owned channel is a free channel, so it's not like cable where you have to pay for it. So it's it's virtually in every house. So they've got a couple of hours kind of where they schedule educational content and classes for children. So again, that was a trend that we picked up on very early during this lockdown and the school shutdown. So we created a whole range of audiovisual books which could play out on television. So our books are, there's an audio track that you can listen to, and the text appears at the same time in same language subtitling, much like a karaoke track, right? So you can listen to the story and you could read the story yourself. And hopefully that's one more way that a child, reads and learns. So, yeah, so I'm saying, I think we're all cognizant of the fact that technology can do a lot for children and can, enhance the educational experiences. But we've got to be very careful about what are those technology choices. How do you ensure that it's reaching the child who is, who does not have the optimal kind of technology equipment? So,
what would you say is your hope for, I guess, considering it from a global standpoint for children's literacy development, and how you think your organization can play a role in their literacy development?
So we have thus far been very, very focused on building foundational literacy skills, right? I mean, we've been focused on reading, because our point is, unless a child can read and become an independent reader, you cannot be an independent learner. You cannot take charge of your own, learning. So our focus has been very, 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 very clearly on getting children to read, and getting children to read fluently, to love to read, etc. Just the way that we became readers and learners, right? Because once you learn to read, the whole world opens up to you. You can, and we're also such a text-based world, right? Whether it's what you do on your phone, whether it's, how you engage digitally, everything is text-based. So unless you learn how to read, you're not going to be able to participate fully in the world of education and learning. So our focus has very much been on building reading skills, and I think it's going to remain there till we get to a point where all of our children are, reading, and then we'll think of the next big mountain to climb.
I'm thinking, you're making me think now of students I've taught who were training to be either elementary or middle school teachers in English. And time again, we have them sort of trace their own literacy biography and when literacy started to make such an impact on their lives. And so many of them talk about the foundational literacy experiences that they had. And they talk about it both at home and at school. And that story time was played such an important role, and enjoyment around that, and even choice about that. And unfortunately, a lot of them talk about how there's a shift that happens often when students get a little bit older in their preteen, middle school years, and everyone's expected to read the same story and answer questions about it. So one of the things that I think Pratham Books, the website Storyweaver, does provide is that element of choice as well. So I could envision a parent sitting with their child and making the choices around the kind of story that they want their child to read. But I also think a child with your website could have a lot of agency with that as well. This is the kind of character I want to read about today, or this is the kind of topic that I want to explore. Or just because kids are kids, they might want to hear a story in a different language that's unfamiliar to them. And I do appreciate that your website can provide all those options for children.
We very recently heard about a 6-year-old child in one of the states in India where we are rolling out the reading program with UNICEF, and the child's a diabetic, and she hated going to school because she needed her insulin shots and all of that stuff. And through the reading program, which is actually being delivered to her home through a WhatsApp message once a week. Mm-hmm. She heard the first story and she didn't want to stop. She wanted the next story. So the WhatsApp messages are sent by the teacher. So we send the link to several teacher WhatsApp group, and they then forward it to the children, the parent. And she just messaged back her teacher and said, I want more stories. Please send me more stories. This is how I like to kind of read. I don't like going to school. So I think you're right. I'm saying giving agency to a child is a very important part of how a child responds to a particular activity. And if she can pick a language and a book and a story of her choice, I mean, hopefully she'll become a more committed reader than having to be, having a prescriptive kind of format to work with.
Wonderful. So our time is coming to an end. Suzanne, is there anything final that you think that our viewers should know about Pratham Books and work going forward?
Oh, well, nothing beyond what I've said so far. So we continue on our journey of, of engaging books, of spreading the joy of reading, and hopefully getting millions of children to become readers and learners.
Wonderful. It was so wonderful to talk with you this morning.
Likewise, Chantal. Very nice talking to you. And thank you for having us on this event.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.